Welcome to the 23rd America Lecture. I'm Michael Naunberg, the current president of the Emeriti Association, and I'm very pleased to have today Pavel Machotka, who will talk about, will give the talk. He will be introduced by Bill Domhoff, who is a professor in psychology. He was a Emeriti professor in psychology and sociology. Before starting, however, I just wanted to say a couple of things. One of the organizational things. One of them is please turn your cell phones off. That's traditional. And there will be a period at the end where you can ask questions, and we'll have people with microphones. Wait till the microphone gets to you and speak clearly. And I requested Pavel to repeat your question so everybody can hear it and hear his answer. And afterwards, we will have some refreshments. Okay, Bill, where is Bill? Bill is going to now introduce Pavel.
Well, I'm very pleased to introduce Pavel tonight, even though I've grown so unaccustomed to public speaking that I'm as nervous as I could manage to be. It's really an honor and privilege to introduce and welcome back to home Pavel Machotka from his home in Italy, where he and his wife Nina have lived since 2000. And they are now citizens of the world, because not just the US, not just Italy, but also most of Europe. As you know, Pavel's a retired professor of psychology, served the campus in many capacities between 1971 and his retirement in 94. He was provost of Porter, he was chair of psych, he was chair of the Senate Committee on Privilege and Tenure, very crucial juncture when he did that, and chair of the Senate. After his retirement, he wrapped up work he was doing on personality in general and on psychotherapy, fully focused on his true general interest, lifelong interest in the psychology of artistic creativity and the genius of Cezanne in particular. And it was part of his quest for understanding. He also continued his own work as a painter, which helped deepen his understanding of the process of painting, as well as leading to a dozen exhibitions of his own paintings since his retirement. His general interest in artistic creativity in general led him to write two post-retirement books, Style and Psyche in 1999, and Painting in Our Inner World in 2003. And what they did was to prepare him to then focus in even more on Cezanne. And so there was a book in 1996 with Yale University Press on Cezanne, Landscape into Art, which received numerous favorable reviews, had staying power, impact, and he was asked to bring out a major revision in 2014 with a French publisher. He published a further book or two on Cezanne, On Site with Cezanne in 2006, and really a culminating magnum opus kind of intellectual work on Cezanne in 2008 entitled Cezanne, the Eye and the Mind, which incorporates all of his insights on the psychology of artistic creativity based on empirical work in psychology. In addition to continuing his work on Cezanne and giving talks all over Europe and continuing with his own painting, he continues his record of service that he started here in Santa Cruz. He's on the editorial board of two major academic journals having to do with aesthetics and empirical studies of the arts. And he has helped the Czech Republic preserve its history by co-editing a book with a Czech historian. It's based on the writings of several participants in the Prague uprising in 1945. But we're not just here tonight to welcome back Pavel to give an Emeriti talk. We're here to honor him for yet another achievement, which is based on his amazing productivity and scholarship since his retirement. He is the 2015 winner of the UC-wide Constantine Panunzio Distinguished Emeriti Award for Outstanding Post-Retirement Scholarship. Please join me in welcoming and congratulating our old buddy, longtime colleague and friend, Pavel Machotka.
I feel nothing but embarrassment at Bill's very kind introduction. He managed to say everything that can be put on paper about me, and I don't know how much of it is as solid as his wonderful words. Thanks, Bill. And it's wonderful to be among friends. It's extraordinary to be among so many friends. I feel very welcomed. Thanks. Now, a tiny bit of a small paragraph of autobiography, which will introduce the topic of the lecture. In effect, the issues that I will be bringing up today are ones that I felt already as an undergraduate, I mean, at a much less intellectual level. That is to say that by the time I was a senior student, I was still unsure whether I was interested in the humanities or in the sciences. In fact, I was even less interested in the social sciences, I thought. I took what I think was a strong vocational interest, Mike, which showed a deep interest in the natural sciences and in the humanities. I chose instead to go into psychology. That turned out not to be a bad choice because ultimately I could rejoin the things that I was so deeply attached to as an undergraduate. As an undergraduate, I took an introductory humanities course, the kind that was taught at the University of Chicago, and grew to love analysis of literature, of music, and of painting. And ultimately, that never left me. In graduate school, thanks to a wonderfully permissive advisor, Gordon Allport, I was allowed to do a dissertation on aesthetics as long as I conceived of it in psychological terms. That turned out to be a developmental study of children's aesthetic criteria, in which I showed that, it turned out to be the case that children developed essentially, or at least roughly, according to the Piagetian stages of development, and that they did so both in the United States and in France, so that there was no strong cross-cultural effect. That essentially confirmed me in the knowledge that it was possible and it was permissible in pursuing a career in psychology to do research in the arts. Ultimately, a few years later, that interest led to the University of California at Santa Cruz. It led to an offer from Provost Hall to join College 5, an arts college, because he wanted that college to really function in the sense that each faculty member would have an interest in the arts and contribute to some collegiate program. That collegiate program turned out to be something that he asked me to write, so I wrote it, and we pushed it through the various committees in the still fresh University of California. This is 1970, 71. And had a collegiate major, the aesthetic studies major. In some ways, that was a lovely confirmation to me professionally to be able to do something like this for students, to have them study one of the arts and then write an essay, a critical essay about what they had studied or accomplished or found out. That's the extent of my autobiography, and I will go on to the subject of my talk, which is how much can psychology contribute to studying the arts? I will segue from that into a discussion of Cezanne, and Cezanne will in turn will help me reflect on things that psychology can explain and things that psychology cannot explain. I will introduce the problem of thinking scientifically as well as artistically by a piece of research that I did, which was my last longish piece of research here before retirement. But to introduce it, it's best for me to just summarize the things that all of you know, of course, but the summary is useful for me at this moment. The methodology of the sciences against the methodology of the humanities, or this is scientific thinking as against humanistic thinking, professionally as well as personally. The listing is actually quite brief. Science requires the hypothetical approach. That is, it requires one to state a hypothesis in order to be able to say which variables will then be studied, and then in order to connect them. In humanistic thinking, you generally engage in observation. Observation that is not necessarily limited to the hypotheses with which you might start if you are doing so unconsciously, because it allows you to keep on observing other phenomena which you may not have been prepared to observe. So that's one difference. Naturally, the natural sciences are numerically based. The humanities are not numerically based, they're verbally based, which introduces a certain degree of ambiguity to them, which they also need, as against the precision that science needs. Ultimately, science wants no mysteries. It finds them all the time, but then attempts to go beyond them. But in a way, humanistic thinking is perfectly content with mysteries, that is, with things that it cannot explain, and does not feel defeated if it has not been able to go beyond them. I think the goal of scientific thinking is prediction, because if you understand phenomena, the ones that you have studied that have taken place until you study them, you should be able to predict what they will be in the future. Very little of that occurs in humanistic thinking. The goal is understanding, having the sense that you understand. And ultimately then, there is a difference in determinism and free will. Now, this is a very long topic, and I will only mention that it is the difference. Ultimately, science has to believe in determinism, because if determinism does not exist, then there could be no prediction, at least not precise prediction. The humanistic thinking has to accept things that have never existed, that cannot be explained. In other words, into humanistic thinking, you have to introduce some degree of free will. You have to accept originality rather than as something caused by something else. Now, these are issues then that even I had to deal with as a psychologist trying to study the arts. I will then give you a brief introduction to one of the studies and mention some of the results that I have obtained. I'm supposed to turn on this microphone, and I've just found it. This was a study in which I attempted to see whether artistic creation could also be explained by the personality of the creator. The setup is, of course, in certain ways absolutely simple. You have to have a systematic measure of the creativity of people whom you will study, that is, under controlled conditions. You have to have a good, complex measure of personality, and ultimately you'll want to combine the data statistically. I will describe that as well. The subjects who volunteered to take part in this study were introduced to Adobe Photoshop, that is Photoshop 2, which dates me, doesn't it? And taught certain operations, selection, and use of certain filters and so on, so that they could start manipulating images. Once they were at a certain level, they were given a choice between 7 slides representing landscapes, leaves and fruit hanging from trees, and things like that, quite innocuous. Asked to choose one, and asked to transform it into a work of art. This ambiguity put them off usually at first, and one would hesitate in the most empirical journals to confess that one had been that vague. But within 5 minutes, every participant found his or her way and did something with the image. In other words, they transformed a photograph into something that they could consider art. That process of transformation is what I will be talking about. I'm not a fan of most of the objective measures of personality, certainly not questionnaires. And for an earlier piece of research, I designed a questionnaire that has to be administered orally. It takes about an hour and a half or 2 hours, with recording all the answers. This questionnaire, that is, this set of questions, because it is not an objective questionnaire, touches upon interpersonal relationships, past and present, with parents, with siblings, with friends and lovers, on on religious beliefs, their existence or not, on things that make people anxious. And so you can see where this is leading. This is a psychodynamic kind of interview. My thinking has always been along psychodynamic lines. This gives us a complex, perhaps imprecise measure of personality, but as I'll try to show you, it all does fit into the images that the people make. Ultimately, we studied 72 participants over a period of 7 years. It was that much time devoted to each participant. We had a clear image of what the person worked on, what they thought they were putting, or what they told us they were putting into their work, and a quite clear image of the process, because we made recordings as the process went on, and then finally we had an image at the end. And then we had a clinical picture of how the person functions. That was, of course, obtained by somebody else. This is important to say because that is at least a minimal scientific thinking that one has to do about this. We as a group of usually 5, 6, 7 students, different each of the 7 years, some are here actually, we reached a kind of clinical picture of each student. That is, so-and-so is showing forms of this kind of type in his picture, for example, and the pronounced conflicts that he had told us about are of such and such a nature. 72 interpretations, interesting, psychodynamically rich, and not presentable in any scientific journal. The way to solve that problem was to give each of the images a rating, again by other raters, and then to cluster analyze them to see how these 72 images break into clusters. We chose the finest solution, 7 clusters, and essentially had 7 styles of images. And now comes the part where one holds one's breath. If everything had gone well, then each type of image should correspond to some a similar kind of personality configuration or a similar set of personal considerations that the person had let us see. And these configurations should not overlap between the 7 clusters. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to tell you that after 7 years, it turned out exactly that way. So I had not just 7 types of images, but I had 7 ways of constructing them, or 7 ways of doing art. For me to summarize all 7 would become confusing. Even I can't remember all 7, but I'll give you examples of 3 of them. One cluster was kind of formless, that is, that there was no particular emphasis on form within the images. The person worked rather, I'm wondering if this has been turned off because I am unable to advance to the first, oh, got it, thank you. That is, there was no particular concern for aesthetic form. It was something that the person just did. What were the commonalities among the few subjects who were in this particular cluster? Well, they all had childhoods that they remembered with displeasure. They still evoked very negative feelings at this point. And they had each, and in fact each, which was lovely, made a decision to do better in life, to help, in the very least, to help other people, or perhaps to put it this way, to help themselves get over the childhood by helping others. All of them wanted to become psychotherapists. It's unusual to be quite that clear, but it was clear here. So what they were using the image for was an externalization of what we would call reparative desires, desires to repair a reality that had been negative and dreary. This image was called Ye World. Ye's are the people labeled with the Y-E-E, and they are very nice people. They resist the invasions of the occasional Yip, which is the other creature that inhabits this world, and manage to smile their way through life. I must say this was a good humor. I mean, I essentially had a kind of paternal feeling toward each of the participants, in part because they so honestly revealed themselves. So there's one image, pardon me, there. Here's another one that's quite different. I mean, it's not exactly formless, but it doesn't stop for form. There's flowing water, it seems. There's some fruit, and there are leaves left over from the image with which the person had started. And then as you look, you notice that the green part of the image is filled with hands reaching for the fruit. Indeed, the title of the image for this participant is Feeling Through to the Flow of Water. A participant who perfectly openly and without any disguise told us that he was very close to his mother. He identified as his mother. And the closeness was exacerbated by the fact that he had 4 siblings, and his mother had each of the 5 by different men, which meant that at no point could she be close to any one of the infants. So he felt he always needed that closeness, that he never quite had that closeness. Here are all 5 hands, all 5 of the children reaching for the fruit, and that is, of course, the mother. So again, it is a wish fulfillment of a kind of reparative kind, something that he missed very much and symbolized in the image that he created. That is essentially one way of doing things, one out of the 7 that we studied. The second one is entirely different in its image construction. It is dense. It tends to have a lot of black. One other example will have a lot of black. This picture is called Graffiti, and indeed there's plenty of graffiti around, but there's a pair of eyes that's looking down. And even while working, the subject was able to tell us that is people looking up at those big eyes and being scared. And what are they scared of? Multinational corporations. But then the subject wanted to say, but that could be my dad, because my dad was an imperious, arrogant man obsessive, who absolutely had to have us behave absolutely correctly at all times. And she symbolized that fear, that sense, that need for order, because she herself became somewhat obsessive, as she was able to say, by the way. I'm not making a critical remark about anyone here. And with that obsessiveness, obviously filled the image to the point where there's not a chink anywhere, there's not a breath of fresh air. That is essentially the characteristic of this cluster. This person did the same thing. His pronounced conflict was of a different nature. He had a very unpleasant adolescence, actually. A brief psychosis, alcoholism, stuff that he had come out of by the time he was in his 20s, but he spent all of his time, in a way, grabbing a hold of himself and making sure that there was no return to any of that disorganization. You can see how in this cluster, essentially, we have a repetition of forms, a piling on of forms, a little bit like a collage, to the point where everything becomes dense and impenetrable. And there's also a lot of black here, as there is in the other participants who are in this cluster. Oh, and by the way, this has a parallel with certain painters. And the painter in this case would be Max Beckmann, who also had a very unpleasant childhood in relation to his father, determined that he would become famous. And in fact, he did. He was the earliest graduate of the art academy that he attended, and became famous by the time he was in his early 20s. But it was a relentless and obsessive kind of drive. I'm trying to suggest that what we're finding here in the experiment is relevant to the world of art. Oh, the previous cluster would have been relevant to Henri Rousseau, a primitive French painter of about the time of Picasso. Picasso liked his work so much that Rousseau himself became famous. He did the Painted Gypsy in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and other portraits, very similar negative childhood, and one of his famous, but surely not the best paintings, shows him with the decoration of the Légion d'honneur, which of course he never received, but in his painting, in his self-portrait, did. I will get to one more cluster only, and this one is very much engaged with form. It is one in which each of the participants attempts to unify his image in whatever way they thought best. In this image, called the fruit tree, the unification is in part stylistic and in part thematic. Thematic because the persimmons that were in the original photograph have been turned to heads. And stylistic because all of the lines that create those heads, as well as decorating the persimmons, are of a similar style, similar feel, and similar length and size. She was trying to integrate her father with her mother, essentially. Her father, a computer-driven manager of a fruit farm, and her mother, who was a painter. And the masculine and feminine were something that she attempted to do here, as well as in other work that she told us that she had done. And why is everybody a fruit tree? Well, that is the metaphor for the parents' fruit farm on which she had lived all her life until she came here. So it is an attempt at unification, and this is the characteristic in question here. And here we have another very unified image, unified by quite different means. The person worked only with the colors that he found in the original slide, which is in fact a very desiccated hillside in Sicily, introduced water, but with the blue that he found in the photograph itself. The integration here is stylistic, yes, but it is also psychological in that he told us that the most painful event in his life was his parents' divorce. When one stayed in California, the other moved to the East Coast, and where he and his sister would have to join them each year on a long plane flight. Unforgettable experience for him, and the need for integrating everything was produced by that. Now this obviously invites something about Cezanne, and I'm sure you're all waiting for that, as am I. Cezanne was a painter who found ways to integrate his paintings quite incredibly, by means of brushstrokes, by means of composition, by means of resolved tensions, created tensions and resolved tensions. just to say a few words about the still life. It is in some ways classical, isn't it? It has a tall object in the center, this decorative picture, and the rest disposed around it. And it is also perfectly balanced in terms of colors. A gentle but absolutely persuasive set of oranges for the oranges in the plate, and reds and yellows for the apples. Well, they did turn the lights way down, but if it were possible to turn them down further, that'd be nice. Yeah. Could you try? Michael, you'll have to go to Switzerland to the collection where this is found. I'll give you all the data on it. Sorry, that I can't do any better. Enormous attention here. The whole thing is tilted slightly to the left. Cezanne did that quite often, which means that at no point do you feel anything static. You are always moving either with it or you're moving against it in order to cope with the tilt. There's tension in the sense that the bowl of fruit and the pitcher press against the background cloth, and it in turn presses back against them. So you're not quite sure whether the painting is moving in or out. Well, it's of course doing both, but for the viewer, perhaps not both at the same time. And it is harmonious and aggressive at the same time. It is aggressive in the white tablecloth that comes forward from the picture. That is painted with short, straight brushstrokes, like little bolts of lightning, where all the rest is quite harmonious. What Cezanne did, and this is meant to be an illustration of his qualities that I want to talk about, was to create ways of tensing up the picture, and then ways of controlling the tension. There is very little in psychology that explains why that should be. He was indeed a tense individual, a nervous, very intelligent, talented young man. His development was mostly actually marked by a close friendship with Émile Zola, and a third man who never quite had the same fame as those two. All three were deeply intellectual adolescents, recited poetry from memory to each other, performed pieces, and even translated French into Greek or Latin, which all three had mastered because that was required in the French schools of the 19th century. This made both Zola and Cezanne decide to become artists, to devote their life to art. I should put it like that. It's not a question of profession necessarily. It wasn't even clear to Cezanne whether he would devote himself to literature or to painting. He, in fact, wrote passionately and interestingly, wrote some poetry, which survives in his letters, which is spunky, clever, and in a very lively kind of French. So he could do that too. But to put it briefly, his father would have none of it. His father, a self-made banker, the richest person in Aix-en-Provence, also perhaps the most shunned because he was an arriviste, wanted his son to make the family respectable and to study law. So the young Cezanne, at the age of 18, went to study law, though he wanted to do nothing better than paint. But he studied law, and as I can imagine it, pouted at family dinners and so on until his father just gave in and took him to Paris and set him up This is often forgotten in his, or at least forgotten as an emphasis in his biographies. But his father set him up and returned. The father suspected that the son would not last. And the father was right. Cezanne returned within 6 months. And at this point, the father did not make him study law anymore. He just employed him in his bank. And Cezanne was even unhappier there than he had been in law school. And after more, what I expect was kind of pouting, because he just would not go into open conflicts with his father. He was too afraid of his father. After a lot of pouting, the father gave way once more and allowed Cezanne to go to Paris to seek his career. That was the only way to seek a career. Cezanne was 21 or 2 at that time, so this is now 1861. And indeed, he stayed. It was quite a while before he returned to Aix, but it was only for a visit to the family. He met some of the people who would become the future Impressionists. He met Monet, Renoir, and he met the older Pissarro, who was 9 years older than Cezanne, and figured deeply in his life. Now, these are brief little facts of his biography, and I will mention others as I go along and show pictures. And the question will be, and I hope you're asking it for yourselves, I'm not sure I trust my answer, what psychology have we got here, or do we have to look at something else in psychology in order to get at answering some of the questions about Cezanne? That is, why did he paint the way he did? This slide is a product of his early 50s, so in 1892 or so. But I wanted to show that first to show you what heights he had attained. But when he was a young man of 18, he would paint little aseptic things like these two children, which is done after another painter, I think Proudhon, but I'm not absolutely sure. I will not spend time on this. He was quite sentimental. Part of him was quite sentimental when he was young, but he was also painting in part for his mother, who was quite religious. And then one of the saints, looking at the crucifix, perhaps not so sentimental, but certainly deeply religious. But then there was another Cezanne at this time, that is in 1860 roughly, who would paint a religious scene that has absolutely nothing to do with organized religion. I mean, I would imagine this surprises nobody in California, but in the rest of the world, this would not look like a religious painting. And it is indeed a bunch of enthusiastic devotees of a piece of some kind of light coming down from the sky. They are in ecstasy, and the object is obviously of enormous religious importance. It's simply called a religious scene. So there was a part of Cezanne that had nothing to do with acceptance of all the rules that are implicit in the preceding two paintings. And we'll see this bursting forth until it becomes a way of life. At the age of 27, he has a lovely year painting mostly with a palette knife. And he does this perfectly successful landscape, successful in composition, successful in strokes of the knife, and in the absolutely, how should I say, simple balance of colors, red, green, blue, and yellow, essentially, distributed fairly apart from each other. 1866, Impressionism had not been invented yet, as it were. That is, the future Impressionists worked, but not by the technique of small touches. That was a product of 1870 to 1874 when they had their first exhibit. But Cezanne is having an excellent year in 1866. He paints a still life. He paints two, but I'll show you one. A leg of lamb with apparently enormous verve. I mean, certainly it feels that way now it's in its finished and dried state. I don't think he painted very fast. I think he painted quite carefully, partly to make sure that he got the layers of fat and muscle right. He balanced it quite well. The shank is balanced against a baguette, and the painting works in the sense of being both centered and at least on one side, leading out toward the edges, creating space. From the point of view of color, it is a successful painting as well. The deep reds of the muscle are balanced by quite gentle pastel greens that all of this sits on, as well as some greens in the cut of the leg itself. In a way, it's a very minor masterpiece, because there's nothing that one would wish further from it. It is already accomplished. It's not an accomplishment that will necessarily last with Cezanne, because he needs to find other ways of doing things. But it is the product of the year 1866. So are 2 portraits, well, 10 portraits, I will show 2, of his maternal uncle Dominique, his mother's brother, all done with a palette knife, and that is indeed difficult in faces. He has to simplify the eyes to some degree, because you cannot then separate the iris from the rest. But it works perfectly well, and I would imagine he worked quite fast, because as I say, he did 10 of them, and his uncle might have lost patience after 10, but not during the first 10. Oh, and of course, a red cravat and a gray-green background. Cezanne was a master of color balance. One can begin to see it at this point, and one will see it in a much more refined, complex manner later on. This one, perhaps a little less imposing, but just to show you another one, done with absolute self-assurance, using the knife to sculpt the cheek under the right eye. It's on our left. And a simple harmony again, but the skin is different in color. It is pinkish, and that goes better with the grayish blues of the background. So this is that marvelous year of 1866, which is then followed by other styles in the following years. Can only be somewhat schematic, at least about the beginnings. But, oh yes, and I'm still in 1866, a very tall, 6-foot-tall portrait of his father. This is done in the same style, also using the knife, except that is harder to see at the very large scale that the painting occupies. It is a serious painting that is so serious that when you see it in a museum, you forget that there are other paintings in the same room. It is that imposing. Cezanne occasionally had that sense of creating imposing paintings, especially seated portraits. We'll see a few more from a later era. But there are 2 little things that really should be said about this in addition. One is that the still life in the back of the chair is the other still life that I had mentioned, which I did not show you. So he is doing an homage to himself as well. And the second is that father is reading a newspaper that he would never read, because L'Événement was a newspaper that Zola wrote for. It was a leftist newspaper, and his father, being a successful banker, wouldn't stoop so low. But one suspects also that Cezanne's father was not altogether humorless. I mean, he obviously saw the words L'Événement in colossal size in the picture. He allowed the picture to hang in the great salon of their residence. So I think that we, not living with the father, not having to be afraid of him, can see certain ways in which he accepted his son. I've already mentioned the first setup of the apartment in Paris. He also took care of Cezanne for the rest of Cezanne's life when he died, when his enormous property was divided between the 3 children, of whom Cezanne was the oldest. And by then, Cezanne was able to weep when he discussed his father and say what a great man he was. He left me an income of several 100,000 livres, they were francs. Well, so still, this is the year 1866, but now follows a not fallow period, but one that does not have very many distinguished paintings that most people notice until you come to 1870 and you come to this extraordinary still life. Extraordinary because, like most of Cezanne's still lives, it does not aspire to have a meaning. It aspires to a formal coherence. And in fact, if you look at the glass vase in the center, you see that it divides the painting in half vertically, and then the rim of the shelf on which everything stands also divides the painting vertically. So it's almost a perfect division in both dimensions. That could be a dull thing, except that it isn't. It's absolutely irresistible that it has a black and white anchor. The black faceless clock, the anchor of what seems to be a tablecloth, which supports everything. The tablecloth is done in such thick paste that it seems to be made of plaster and something that holds up everything that is on top of it. That is part of the almost awkward, powerful feeling that one has looking at the painting. It is in some ways simple. Oh yes, a bit of blue and yellow in the center. That yellow in the center has to be there for Cezanne because there has to be a focus for the eyes, and it's usually in the center. And it's done in all sorts of ways, sometimes even in landscape. And then it has some meaning which is evident only to Cezanne, nobody quite knows it. That conch is very sexual. There's simply no way in which one can say, oh, what a nice large conch. One says instead, what the heck was going on here? We don't really know, except that Cezanne was motivated by the same impulses as all of us, and occasionally gave way to them in painting. But in the same year, 1870, he can also do a very emotional scene. The title is simply The Murder. Two things should be said about that. One is that it is, of course, an incredibly violent scene. The other is that it is also controlled in a way by being a kind of triangle with the man's body, one of the oblique lines, and the helpless victim's incredibly long, perhaps 2 yards long, arm being the other oblique line. I think that one must not simplify it too much and assume, as I did at the beginning, and as one does, is likely to, seeing his early work for the first time, that Cezanne had a lot of aggressive feelings which he simply had to occasionally ventilate on canvas. But the more art historians have gotten into the evidence surrounding these, and sometimes there isn't any, so we can't know, the more they find that Cezanne frequently was illustrating stories that somebody else had written. And of course, yes, and aggression had to come into that illustration, but there is that social stamp of approval put onto it by being called an illustration. But he is a complex man, and he is now 31 years old. 2 years later, he finally accepts Pissarro's invitation to go join him north of Paris in Auvers, so the two could paint together, or at least see each other after painting. They did paint together a good bit. Now here comes evidence that is of an empirical nature, but is neither specifically scientific nor specifically humanistic. The evidence is the following. I was able to find a number of the sites that he painted in Auvers. That is not all that difficult, it's a small place, including this so-called House of Père Lacroix, which could still be seen at the time I took the photograph, which was many years ago, from the tall window opening out onto the garden of the people who lived about 100 meters from it. Good. Notice the Cezannian dark spot in the center, focusing your eyes. Notice this gentle interplay of oblique lines, including the tree which leans against the red roof and helps keep it from visually slipping off to the right. There are some distortions there which are willful because the angle of the tree is then mirrored in the little picket fence at the bottom, but that picket fence doesn't behave the way picket fences do in water. It manages to lean in the opposite direction in the water itself. That's part of the composition. Cezanne distorted it relatively little, but when he did so, it was always for the sake of a more coherent, cohesive composition. So that window is still there. And I don't know how my luck held that I found it open. I mean, it need not have held at all. And yes, it is a red patch in the middle of a lot of greenery with a bit of blue here in the upper right corner in the painting in the upper left corner to give you a little bit of breathing space and as well as the color blue. It's simply a content painting. You have not seen a content painting yet, but we are now working with Pissarro, a calming influence. He admires Pissarro deeply. Pissarro admires him as well for his enormous originality. And the result is some very calm, considered, and well-balanced work in Auvers and Pontoise. And that period lasted from 72 to 74. In 74, the Impressionists held their exhibit. They were, of course, a group of independents until a journalist decided to give them a pejorative nickname. And that nickname is perhaps the best known name in the history of art, the Impressionists. He's also now no longer doing any violent scenes, or at least very few, but turning to bathers. His bathers are always awkward. He never painted nudes, sorry, not more than once or twice, from life. But he had done a lot of sketches when he was still in school, actually, in Aix-en-Provence. He used those sometimes to as models for his figure studies. But above all, the painting, besides being the kind of classical triangle with the apex in the center, is delicately colored. And at times one admires what he is after, or one assumes one knows what he is after, by seeing the delicate harmony of colors. The three bathers are of very slightly different colors, but just enough to be able to say that they are. And otherwise, their harmony of skin tones, sky tones, and yellow and green of the foliage. Oh yes, and of course the tree leans into the figure on the left, as well as into the central figure, establishing a composition. Religion does come up again. This is, I think, 1877, roughly. Notice, that is besides what you are noticing, notice the small parallel touches with which this is painted. Those touches are now consistent throughout the painting, and they give it an enormous control over the surface, and they give Cezanne, and hopefully his viewers, a sense of a scene that is under the control of the painter's brush, even though it is at the same time not an abstraction, it is a scene. Yes, but it is a scene in which the hapless Saint Anthony is confronted by an irresistible nude and by what looks like the offer of a contract from the devil who stands above him. I return, however, to the parallel touches because they're going to become more and more important. Yes, so Cezanne's impulses are those of any one of us. He sometimes gives way to them, especially as he's young, but as his brushstroke matures, he finds ways of mastering them by consistency, consistency of the surface of the whole painting, and mastering them by embedding them in a composition that simply works and we're aware of it more than of the content. This, ladies and gentlemen, is an absolutely exceptional painting from the year 1877, just the year after the previous one. It is a scene from a park which has been identified since then, which is quite chaotic, overgrown, and Cezanne has made a perfect order out of it using the palette knife again. He used it almost not at all after this. But for some reason in 1877, he was deeply concerned with the consistency of his canvas surface, so much so that he was willing to invent a new technique. And this one is new. He would use the knife on its side, but first he would put a few dabs of, let's say, green, put the knife up against them, and then draw it down. Not very far. And this gave him all these obliquely oriented strokes. This is a conception of painting that he did not use for another 20 years, actually. He used it once and went on to other things and discovered the late patches, which all of you know, when he was about 55. But in 1877, he also did this magnificent portrait, which hangs in Boston, of his wife. Again, with detached surfaces. You can see them most clearly in her skirt, which nevertheless, no matter how detached, essentially curves over her knees, has stronger reflections at the level of the knees. She leans to the left. The chair, of course, behind her correspondingly leans to the right, and the painting is balanced. The red matches the green wallpaper very well. I think it is more olive green than here, but it is that color in order to go with the chair. And her bodice is an absolute delicacy of slightly greenish blues, ultramarine blues, and slightly violet blues. It is a painting that one cannot take one's eyes off. You perhaps can, it's only being projected here, but I'd recommend the nearest flight to Boston and the Museum of Fine Arts. And we now come to 1880 roughly, or to the culmination of the development of that parallel touch that I had shown you in the painting of The Temptation of Saint Anthony. This is surely one of the great still lifes from that period of about 1880. The word is the parallel touch. Why is it a great still life? Well, the sense of space works very well. The quite saturated fruits seem to balance each other, greens against reds. The knife, as well as the bottom edge of the tablecloth or napkin, point toward the fruit bowl. Everything leans toward the left. In fact, the fruit bowl does not have the bowl sitting on the center, sitting on the stem itself. It is sitting off to the left, leading you again to experience that thing that is the most important about the best work of Cezanne's, that tension, which you feel and yet which you can let go of because it is resolved. Things do stop at the upper left corner. The leaves from the wallpaper that was in his house in 1880 simply stop the composition at that point. If they were not there, if you block them out, it would be empty and have a tendency to want to leave the frame on the left side. So here we are in the style by which he is best known, the parallel touch. If you see any painting with a parallel touch, you know it's Cezanne, unless it's by Gauguin, but that's another story, and it's somewhat different. The parallel touch served him beautifully in landscapes. Now here I have recourse to the evidence that I tried to gather and publish in that book, Landscape into Art. That is to find the bridge in question. There's the bridge in question. With a slightly different amount of light coming in, the trees had not closed over it as they had when he painted in 1880. I will confess to something, and you you probably remember my anecdotes more than what I'm trying to say seriously about Cezanne, but I understand because I'm like that too. This bridge was reconstructed in about the year 2005. Before that, it was made of steel, and I'd photographed it, and it certainly didn't look like Cezanne's bridge. But here, life managed to imitate art, and the good burghers of the nearby town decided to reconstruct the bridge the way Cezanne had seen it. You can nevertheless appreciate what he is after. He is after kind of complete control of the surface of the painting, but a control which allows things to resonate against each other. With each other, yes, the patches of parallel touches right in the center essentially are lined up along with the bridge support on the right, for example, and then some branches oppose them in the upper left. So the painting breathes, and that's surely one of the secrets of Cezanne. If you have a psychological explanation of that, I will publish it for you. I don't. It is what I described in my discussion of the differences between the scientific and humanistic thinking. It is a surprise to everybody, and it's a surprise to Cezanne. Of course, he developed it, and developed it slowly, but nevertheless, he did not know 10 years before that he would ever paint like this. We cannot explain originality, in short. Yes, there's talent, that's a nice word. There's genius, it's an even nicer word, but bigger. And then there is the evidence for these two, namely, what is it that the painter does, or any other artist, that leads us to feel that, to know that we're in the presence of something utterly original. During the 5 years that he uses a parallel touch, he sometimes uses it very finely. Here, it is to underscore the undulations of the earth, of the hill that leads up to this particular building. The building has been discovered recently. It cannot be photographed from exactly the same spot, but the rocks that you see in the front are there. The wall behind it that has fallen down was the one you saw in the painting. And another room has been added, which is not in the painting, but at least we do know that that structure existed. We do know that the planes intersected, but they did not intersect quite the way they do in the painting. Here, the intersections are many more complex, and one feels almost on top of a gentle wave. Of course, the building doesn't allow you to feel that for very long. In terms of color, it's an unusual painting also because it is quite grayish. This is not an inadequate slide. This is what it looks like. The blues of the sky and the Naples yellows described in the building, which are then found in various other parts of the hillside, are all of them toned down with gray. And then there's this complex painting from that same period, which is composed of, whose parallel touches have another purpose. Let me show you why. This is what the scene looks like, or did when I photographed it. This was some building. These are cottony rocks, as it were. They're billowing. And the whole scene would make a lovely postcard, and your mother would say, that's a nice postcard and thanks for sending it, but not a good painting. That is something that Cezanne here devoted enormous energy, and I would think time, to. So that hillside, which recedes so easily to the right in reality, is here slowed down with a parallel touch, which is set down at right angles to the movement of that. The rocks in the center, on the other hand, are painted with a vertical touch, staying put where they should be staying put and stabilizing what otherwise would be a cacophonic scene. The mountains in the background are made to parallel the little hill on this side of the bay, as is the smaller mountain paralleling the house. Paralleling the house that you see in the distance. It is there, but it's a good bit smaller. It is indeed in front of that smaller mountain, but of course that mountain is much smaller. Cezanne emphasized what he had to emphasize, once again to give you a sense of composition. He can also paint, smudging the paint all over. This is dated probably 1890 or so. I dated it myself. And it is an utterly original use of the surface, which he used only once. I emphasize that partly because I think highly of the painting, but in order to show you how Cezanne essentially thought of the brushstroke as something that needed to be appropriate to the particular scene. This young man was in fact a photograph of a young man, and Cezanne painted it from a photograph. He gave the elbows slightly greater asymmetry which is actually, for some reason, emphasized in the right nipple, the one on the left side, which makes the same lozenge as the elbows. What strikes one about this is also almost 6 feet tall in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. What strikes one is the effortless color harmony, completely satisfactory. I feel I'd like to have ever achieved just that harmony. And then the asymmetry of the figure, which is just a tad more symmetrical in the photograph. Its left leg forward, its left shoulder down, and the right side back and higher up. A style never to be used again. In landscape, we're now in 1890s, he is abandoning the parallel touch and painting much more freely. We see several happy paintings, not all of them happy though. This one of a pigeon tower, which still stands. A pigeon tower which is emphatic when you see it because it is whitish. The morning sun strikes it brilliantly, and it has a red and green stripe going across it, which makes a perfect focus near the center for our good painter. That, by the way, is red and green because it's tile, it's not stucco. And it's tile because up above it are the dovecots, and one does not want one's rats to get to the pigeons. And rats are notoriously bad climbers when it comes to tile. I cannot do otherwise, however, than to show you the photograph of this, which has been transformed by the addition of another building. But you can see how the impetus to this happiness was given by the scene itself at about 9:30 in the morning, by what was highly visible at the time, the whole pigeon tower, with this enormous rotundity, and by the very simple color scheme, blue on the bottom, green on the bottom, blue on the top, and the reddish roofs in the center. And apropos of that, I must show you something Cezannian here too. Not quite visible in these slides, but not altogether invisible. The sky is painted with one type of touch only. It goes from the upper left down to the lower right. Why does it do that? With the emphasis that you've heard me mention about Cezanne's paintings, to balance the roof of the dovecot. And indeed, when you see it, you have no sense of, wait a second, this is leaning a little bit to the left or whatever. It is a sky that gently balances the composition. I'm sorry, I'm going on the wrong direction, and I would normally not apologize for that, but when I go fast, I would apologize. Around 1892, there's a series of 5 paintings of card players. His peasant friends, who would sit, of course, who would not be aware that they're modeling. So still would they be while engaged in their cards. Again, that tension between pure verticality and a slight off verticality. The bottle leans slightly to the left, so does the wall behind them, so do the legs of the table. And of course, so does the back of the chair of the man on the left. It makes the man on the right appear to be leaning in, to be, as it were, leading the relationship. He may well be. I think the head of the man on the left is a bit small, and yet surely that is what Cezanne wanted. There are 3 versions of this. I think this is the loveliest one, and it's also the smallest. Ah, yes. You have thought of it yourselves, I don't need to say it, but all these colors are secondary. There's not a single primary color here, unless you consider black to be that. It is all dirty yellows, dirty browns, reddish browns, and then a complex mottled red-orange in the tablecloth. Now, without repeating too much of the kinds of things I always say, I should say that here the touches are very small, and I think they're very small in relation to the complexity of the scene that he saw. In other words, the only way to give you the sense of foreground and equally solid and well-painted background is to have done the background in small touches. But I can show you why I say that, because some 40 years later, that scene was photographed. Those little oaks have grown considerably. The cistern and the rocks and other paraphernalia for a mill that was never built are there. The composition is taken literally from what Cezanne saw. The treatment is literally pure Cezanne. That can be said for northern scenes where the light is quite different, more likely to be violet, violetish, and not as brilliantly yellow at any point. It is based on seeing a group of rocks such as this one against the same light. I got that far, but no further. But the forest of Fontainebleau is colossal, and with 3 men who were actually guides to the forest, now retired, driving me around in their car, hoping to find this site, and not finding it at the end of the day, I know that it no longer exists. It could have been mined. It is an extraordinary painting, again, in purely secondary colors, which hangs in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. A bit of dirty yellow, a Naples yellow with a bit of white in it in the center, which is the only kind of organic-looking shape, mediates between these intrusive, colossal rocks, stands between them like a referee, and of course gives an opportunity to put in yellow as against the violetish tones of the rest. Not all of them are visible in this slide, but it is in fact quite complex. We're reaching his late work now. Late portraits, for example. The portrait of his dealer, Ambroise Vollard, which he did in 1899, now 7 years before his death. Once again, purely secondary colors. It's a brown and that an art historian, an English art historian called ginger, and everybody in England understands what ginger is, but that is the brown that you see in his coat. Painted over 150 sittings, presumably. I don't think one should remember that about it, but remember that it's a great portrait. And Cezanne considered it unfinished. Cezanne was said to have said by Vollard, he was his art dealer, they talked about art, but you left 2 spots in the knuckles of my hand. And Cezanne is supposed to have said, again according to Vollard, but Monsieur Vollard, if I fill those in the wrong way, I'd have to begin the painting from that point outward again. Surely, well, Cezanne, like any Parisian, would have that, or adopted Parisian, would have a sense of wit and would be able to stick it to his dealer, who was trying to provoke him in turn to say something about his technique. What Cezanne did say at the end of the session is that he is quite content with the shirt front. As he should be. That shirt front is not white. That shirt front is various shades of turquoise, light greenish blues, and even oranges. Again, it's easier to see that in real life, so I recommend that over this slide, as good as the slide is. Oh yes, the forehead is made taller than it was in reality, and I think it was made taller partly to accommodate the two ovals of his hairline, which of course mirror the chimneys just outside the window. I mean, it's curious enough, tightly composed without calling attention to the composition. And now I come to the late still lives, landscapes. Again, a happy painting. This always has to be said about Cezanne because it is the exception. That doesn't make it greater, but it does make it very happy, and one cannot resist it. This site has become the center of much of controversies in the artistry world. Did Cezanne make the mountain larger? That's according to one historian who wrote about this and insisted that Cezanne flattened all his space, or was it in fact the same size? That will never be answered because the site is so overgrown that we can barely glimpse the top of the mountain itself. The only photograph that existed from about the time was taken by John Rewald, but he couldn't see the mountain either, so he photographed it from nearby and then glued a picture of the mountain onto the thing. However, that is a problem because all you have to do is glue it 1 millimeter higher or lower, and the art historical conclusion differs. However, as a stripling, in the year 1862, I visited the quarry of Bibemus in Aix-en-Provence with a colleague of mine, equally interested in art, and I just snapped this nice photograph, and I'm the only one who's ever photographed that motif in color, by pure luck, ladies and gentlemen, by pure good fortune. The mountain is in the back. It's more whitish, but nevertheless it has slightly violet tinge to it, as it does in the painting, but not that clear. The rocks are the stone of which most of Aix-en-Provence was built. So they are vertical because they've been cut that way to make construction stones of a certain size. Sometimes they were actually cut on the diagonal. You can see that on the rock on the left. And there are many paintings he did in the quarry which show precisely that oblique angle, which is a result of quarrying that goes back to Roman times and was still practiced in the 19th century. As it were a companion piece, or at least a painting that was done in much the same period as the first one that I showed, the so-called Apples and Oranges, perhaps his most famous still life. It is a painting of enormous daring, I think, because it's one of the few still lifes that I know which are not painted on the horizontal. That is, the tablecloth and all these apples and oranges sit on a table which is oriented at an angle toward you, but they are distributed in such a way that they make a horizontal line. Essentially, that's an incredibly complex space for a still life, one that kind of commands a constant attention on the part of the viewer. The reds and the oranges are another combination that is very difficult to put together. How many of us would think of putting reds and oranges together? Reds with their complementaries, okay. Oranges with their complementary blues, okay, but with each other. But Cezanne somehow manages it, in part by introducing a little bit of blue in between the individual fruits, or a bit of blue-green, in part by painting those two very complex rugs on which everything sits and against which everything leans, as it did in the other still life that I showed you. It is the same picture, but with a reddish rose on it against a bluish one in the other one, because rose would not have fit into the color scheme of the composition. He is obsessed, nevertheless, toward the end of his life, with what he always thought would be his best painting, his claim to fame, that is a painting that rivals that of the Venetians. That rivals that of the Venetians in size and complexity of figure arrangements, and certainly, in the fearless nudity of most of the figures. He didn't quite succeed. This is an awkward painting, but I must show it to you because it should also be said that Cezanne was Cezanne to some degree in spite of himself. If he could have had anything in life, he would have painted like Tintoretto. He admired the Venetians in the Louvre. You could see them, they're so magnificent ones. Well, he attempts that with 3 large bathers. This is the largest and the most peculiar. In a way, you can understand the women's poses. Yes, they are startled, possibly frightened by the figure coming in from the left. But in the original painting, before he corrected it, the figure coming in from the left was in fact a Greek god, trailing this bit of white behind him. And now it seems to be a phallic-headed torso, and we don't have any idea what it corresponds to. But clearly, Cezanne is not always making paintings that are clear, visually clear. Some part of him stays within himself, comes out, but leaves us mystified rather than clarified. Another harmonious painting. I wish I had a photograph of this site. I've been able to photograph the rocks, but they look quite different because all of the trees have burnt. It was a site for a number of watercolors as well. I show it to you because the rocks, which are basically white, are done in shades of blue, white, kind of pale yellow, an orangish yellow, and even flecks, and very deep flecks of blue from the sky. The integration here is such that one is not even aware that they are rocks. This is not a pre-Cubist painting. It's not a forerunner to that. The Cubists perhaps could have thought that, but they were free to do so, but would have been wrong. It is a painting in which a certain degree of abstraction, increasing abstraction, enters and organizes the whole surface impeccably. I will show you just 2 more landscapes for which I do have photographs, so you can judge the degree of fidelity and the degree of transformation in his work. This is a road that led from Aix-en-Provence to the east. It still exists. The pine no longer exists, but other pines cast the same shadow across the road, giving you the and only firm horizontal to anchor everything. The site now looks like this. The road is a little bit wider, slightly lower, and the pine, which becomes such a focus in the middle distance and helps organize the whole space, is no longer there. Nevertheless, that pine that was on top, it's not there any longer, but other pines are, which are essentially the same. They caress the mountain. And The color of the ground on the left, to the left of the road, is indeed a deep red, deeper than one can see in that slide. And that, in turn, gives rise to all the reds which compose the painting. The reds extend certainly all the way to the top of the mountain, but in a pinkish form. And they come all the way to the right side of the painting. The degree of integration is very palpable when you see it in real life, even more so than on this slide. And then we come to one Sainte Victoire, which he saw without anything between him and it. Pardon me, that was wrong. This is right. It still looks like this. So you can still photograph it now at 9:30 in the morning. Why do I say 9:30? Because if you look at the face of the Sainte Victoire, the lit up areas are pinkish. It's an early, fairly early sun. And then the shadows are slightly violet. Now, notice the trees in the foreground, or at least in that little hillock that is closest to you, and the shadows that they cast. The sun has come up an hour and a half before, and they cast shadows that go in a certain direction. Look at the the bottom of this painting and the first hillock. It is made of patches, his late style, his much admired late style, which gave all the permissions to the cubists to do whatever they wanted to do. These patches are patches, but they are also reflections of the shadows of those little trees. I say this because one has to be aware that Cezanne, as complexly as he transformed the landscapes that he saw, only photographed the landscapes, nothing else, was at the same time a landscape painter. That is, he loved the countryside deeply, and he was striving to paint it, to record it, to do it the honor that he felt that he was seeing. Now, I close with this picture. I've had to explain with several of my slides, but not all of them, that 100 years have passed and everything has grown up, and besides the building has gone on and so on. So I don't necessarily have a slide which is so good that you would be able to judge what Cezanne had done in order to transform it into art. But in 1904, a young painter named Émile Bernard visited Cezanne for several weeks, in fact, and went out with him, if not to paint, then at least to see what Cezanne was painting. He, or at least we think it was he, took this photograph. And Cezanne painted this painting. The little olive trees that you saw in the lower right are there. Every one of the buildings in the center, the red center, which becomes a visual focus of the painting, they're all there. Yes, the sky is smooth. On the other hand, the roughness of the nearby hedge is very much conveyed by the particular touches he decides to use here. But in one way it is different. Yes, there are enough touches with a direction of their own coming from the center of the painting down to the lower right to tell you that Cezanne wanting to paint a painting in which it was clear that the road had a centrifugal movement for him, or if you wish to see the painting in the opposite direction, it had a centripetal movement going toward the center. So you can see that although I emphasized in that last cluster that there are young artists who want to integrate everything, and I've shown you two ways in which they could do that, and I compared Cezanne to them, the motives were not necessarily the same. We can't really know. Was he trying to integrate his mother's acceptance and kind of jovial generosity with his father's strictness? We don't know. There's not enough evidence, and I don't think we should try to propose that without having the evidence. So in short, psychology can go only so far. It can draw parallels to the actual world of art. On the other hand, it can show how art works on the part of people of a certain age, 22 22. I studied them at one point in their life, at a very brief point in their life, and I never knew what they would do later. They probably didn't either. Well, that is to say that although I found personality to determine their art, I would not say that it would be the case for the rest of their life. For that reason, I can't say it about Cezanne either, and I have to continue believing in the humanistic exploration, in the absence of causality, and in free will. Thank you. Are there any questions? Oh, I'm sorry, I need to turn this off, but there. That's good. Usually when I say that, there's a question. That's why I said it. It's no trick from teaching. Many of you, I'm sure, do the same thing.
Hello. I'm actually a former student of yours. I took a Cezanne class a long time ago at UCSC, and it's one of the most memorable classes of my time there.
Tell you what, I'll come up closer because I cannot really quite hear you without microphone.
Okay.
I mean, I hear the microphone, but I don't hear the clarity. Yes, maybe.
Yeah, my name is Greg Smith. I took a Cezanne class with you as an undergraduate art student here at UCSC, and it was one of the most memorable classes of my undergrad experience here. But my question is, in looking at his paintings, I was struck by wondering, was he left-handed or right-handed?
Right-handed.
What's that?
Right-handed.
Right-handed, okay, interesting.
Yes.
Does that come up as an aspect of Cezanne and in how you look at
It doesn't
Cezanne?
come up with him, it can come up with other painters, like Van Gogh. I think Van Gogh was left-handed. The strokes looked like they were made with the left wrist, not with the right wrist. Yeah.
Right, okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes?
Was he left wing or right wing?
The question was Cezanne left wing or right wing? Well, his father was right wing, of course. I don't know about his mother. He was somewhat right wing. He was very disappointed in Zola for defending Dreyfus. He said, he was anti-Semitic, or at least insofar as he thought about it, he was more anti-Semitic than not. Yes?
What were his major artistic influences?
Right. The question is, what were his major artistic influences? Well, very early, there was the landscape painter in Aix, Granet. Not very well known outside of France, but a very good painter. In fact, I think he admired his compositions. He admired Courbet for his kind of masculine force. He would have wanted to paint like Courbet very much. He admired Manet. It's quite a different style. You can see that in his still lives. You cannot see it in other works. Presumably he learned from Pissarro during those 2 years that they painted together. The evidence for that is not as clear as it should be, but at least in still lives, it is in landscapes. And later on, well, to hear some people talk about it, he just obsessed about the Venetians, I had suggested. But I would not call that influence. I would call that a forlorn hope. Yes?
I've read that he died from a lightning strike.
The question is whether he died of a lightning strike. He died in a storm. He was overtaken by a storm and got completely wet, collapsed. And he was taken home on a cart by a passing peasant. But he died of pneumonia, in fact, complicated by his diabetes. I had one more painting to show you, but I knew that I would run over time. which was the last one that he did, to which he returned after that collapse. He woke up, was driven to a studio, and finished the portrait of his gardener, Valier. You want to see it? Okay. Am I on? Am I able to go backwards? I mean, I got this far back, but
It's going.
if there's somebody who can get the PowerPoint back on, let's see. No, I'm sorry. Well, yes, yes, I see the same thing here, and it's absolutely the end of the pictures. Wait a second, here's a possibility. Yeah, but now how do we get it? Well, so you at least see the top 2/3 of that portrait. It's an unusual portrait because it is done by horizontal light. It was painted the first thing in the morning at the rising sun. But that was a decision he had made long before, or at least several days before he collapsed. But he managed to finish this painting and then collapsed again. Yes.
Hello, Pavel. I'm a former student, Colleen Kibert. I did my graduate work with you in the early 70s, and I'm still using the teachings that I've learned from you. Thank you so very much. At that time, you were exploring eco-strength, and I'm wondering if you feel that there was or think that there was a development of strength in Cezanne's personality as he continued to work and find integration in his own work.
Thank you for the comment. Do you have a question too?
I'm wondering if you could see that reflection.
Let me make sure
That reflection in Cezanne, as his work became more and more integrated, did you see a development in his ego strength or in his personality?
So the question is whether I saw a development of his ego strength. I wouldn't say that. I saw development of the strength of the painter. That was the part of the ego, but not the whole ego. The rest of the ego had the same sensitivities, suspicions of others that it had always had. I mean, not only those, but those could easily be aroused. Yes. So, no, the painting was not a cure, but it is a way of leading a good life.
And better painting. All right, thank you.
I'd like to ask a question. Bill Domholm mentioned that you're also a painter. And my question is, to what extent your own experience in painting helps you to understand the paintings of Cezanne?
To what extent did my experience in painting help me understand Cezanne? It did a lot, actually. I didn't know that until I painted for several years. Having painted for several years, I wrote books that are quite different than it would have been 10 years before. And I'm going to do my next book on his still lives, or as the historians say, still lives, because those will be purely painterly analyses. I won't have any photographs to compare them with, or none.
Pavel, I mean, I share your admiration for Cezanne, and it's actually my favorite painter too.
Yeah.
And but I wanted to ask you, who is your second favorite painter?
What is the question?
And what makes Cezanne more interesting or better than your second most favorite painter?
He was my first love at the age of 16, which will explain why he's my favorite painter. I first saw him when I was 16 in an art institute. Whatever complexities there were in my relationship to him afterwards, that's harder to say. I must say that if anything, in my painting, I've been way too close to him, and I gave up painting landscapes altogether because I could not conceive of them in any other terms. So I just said, gotta stop. So I started painting the figure. But when one, since we're colleagues, we know each other's work. I've done a lot of other work. It was not only concentrated on Cezanne, but when you see me talking about Cezanne, you think that this is really all, all I'm interested in. No, and even with Cezanne himself, I can grow tired of saying the same things over again or writing the same things over again. He needs to remain fresh, but I suppose of all painters, he has a better chance of remaining fresh with me than others. Thanks, Per.
So maybe we should now thank again Pavel for this excellent lecture.
Thanks. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.